Today's topic is terrorism and the policies around terrorism in the West in particular. The notion of terrorism has really exploded onto our screens since 9/11. For most people, that's for the majority of the world.
The first thing to say about the context of terrorism in Palestine is that until very recently, Hamas and Hezbollah were not proscribed. They shouldn't be. The UN gives every nation the right to resist occupation with arms if necessary. In the case of the Palestinians, these were actually protecting themselves against the occupying power, Britain, and its, guard dog, the Zionist project. In the case of the Zionists, these were indeed terror groups because they attacked the Palestinians, and this was not the country of Zionism.
But it seems to me preposterous that an anti-terror law should go from the point of stopping people blowing places up and civilians to being a tool for arresting ordinary people practicing things which we would have thought were perfect civil liberties.
Some people are now getting 5 and 6 years in jail for climate action. They should be honored. They are fighting against the destruction of the earth. They are trying to protect the people who have not even been born. Instead, they are putting it into jail.
I want to put the context of counter-terrorism as a law beyond that connection that we've clearly made between the way the government is using counter-terrorism as a way of subjugating its own citizens or stopping their freedom of speech in the case of pro-Palestinian activists. But it doesn't stop there. Hello and welcome to Deep Dive Perspective, a show in which we try to get to the truth of things, the depth, the reality. It's all too often the case that we're given fake news, we're given half news, we're told to focus on those aspects of any news story which are symptomatic, rather than looking at root causes or solutions. Well, this show attempts to do quite the reverse. We want to get to solutions and we want to know the real context of any given issue. And today's topic is terrorism and the policies around terrorism in the West in particular. The notion of terrorism has really exploded onto our screens since 9/11. For most people, that's for the majority of the world. And with me in the studio today, I have Professor Haim Bresheeth, who's he's a professor of history, but has been a lifelong campaigner for the rights of Palestinians and indeed an activist par excellence, many would say. He's recently been involved with the police here in Britain, who have been using what's known as the counter-terrorism laws, the first of which was the Counter-Terrorism Act of 2000. And he's an author in his own right. He has a book, An Army Like No Other, referring to the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. It's interesting because terrorism, Israel and anti-Semitism are very interlinked with a lot of what it seems is going along the lines of terrorism and counter-terrorism, particularly in the West. Welcome to the show, Professor Haim.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for coming in. This is a very, I'd say, very fascinating but absolutely critical issue. It started off around that time for 9/11, where the Terror Act started getting formed, and everybody was happy with them because, yeah, okay, nobody wants somebody blowing up buildings and killing innocent civilians. It's got a little broader than that. So, your context, the overall context of terrorism, counter-terrorism laws, and what they mean for the ordinary citizen.
The first thing to say about the context of terrorism in Palestine is that until very recently, a few years ago, Hamas and Hezbollah were not proscribed. They shouldn't be. The UN gives every nation the right to resist occupation with arms if necessary, and normally it is necessary. And this was enacted after the Second World War, where a lot of, most of the nations of Europe had to defend themselves from Nazism. And of course, the Nazis called this terror. They called themselves partisans or freedom fighters, or different names in different languages. They fought against the occupation of their country, and thank God they did that. It's also true that the only people who didn't have a country in Europe, the Jews of Europe, have fought against the Nazis at a much higher rate than the countries they were living in. For example, in Poland and in Russia, Jews, about 15 to 16% of Jews were in the partisan forces. This is compared to less than 1% in all the other countries of Europe. So when people in Israel said to my parents, "Why didn't you fight against the Nazis?" This is nonsensical. Two of my uncles died fighting the Nazis as partisans. So first of all, the idea that what Hamas and Hezbollah are doing is terror is totally wrong. What they're doing is defending their countries. In the case of Hamas, this is Palestine, specifically Gaza. In the case of Lebanon, it is, of course, the only force in Lebanon that actually protects the country. The army of Lebanon never does. So these are not terror organizations. They are basically freedom-fighting organizations.
Well, let me put context to that, because you're very humble, and the reality is that you're an Israeli citizen, you're a Jew, and your parents were Holocaust survivors from Auschwitz itself. So coming from you, this definition of terrorism and the definition of these the H groups is quite fascinating for you to be saying that. What's led you to conclude to this?
Well, first of all, they were what the British called terror organizations in Palestine. And these were both Palestinian organizations and Jewish Zionist organizations. Now, in the case of the Palestinians, these were actually protecting themselves against the occupying power, Britain, and its, guard dog, the Zionist project. In the case of the Zionists, these were indeed terror groups because they attacked the Palestinians, and this was not the country of Zionism, and I still think it isn't. So the British called them all terrorists, but they were not all terrorists. And now the situation is slightly different. Israel is the fourth strongest army on this land, on this earth, and of course it's an active agent of the West. And the situation now is really the West against the rest. This is, an outline of the politics, not just there, but everywhere else, in Ukraine and so on. So what we see there is almost 80 years of occupation of Palestine by Israel. And before Israel existed, 30 years of the British Mandate. So it's more than a century, almost 110 years now, of a situation where no Palestinian was a free citizen of any other country with full rights. And of course, some of them have got some rights. There's 2 and a bit million Palestinians inside Israel, and they are, their rights are disappearing as we speak. And that started about 5 or 6 years ago. So every few months, and sometimes every few weeks, a new law would remove their rights. Some of the rights are symbolic, but very important. For example, Arabic was an official language in Israel.
Well, let me hold you there, because you've raised some really fascinating points which I need to unpack, really. First of all, the connection I'm making to the terror laws here in Britain, the 2000 Act particularly, and then the subsequent iterations, of course. I'm kind of thinking about the King David, the King David hotel, and it was blown up by what would ostensibly be described as Israeli terror organizations, whether it was the Irgun or whether it was the Stern Gang. Fact is, they went around killing civilians and people to have the Israel that they wanted. Now, that would give one argument to say that actually terror in the 20th century was essentially, you could root it there in Israel, that this could be an act of terror. There are many other acts of terror we could probably label, but certainly that connection. And then with Britain today utilizing these terror laws, not just to chase after religious fanatics, which was what the post 9/11 narrative was about, and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, etc., people who bombed and killed indiscriminately, as we're told. But it's also now here in the West, and particularly in Britain, which I know best, it's targeting ordinary individuals who are simply protesting for the freedom and the liberty of Palestinians, and you're one of them. You've been a victim of this, I know. But this seems to be now exploding onto the scene, where a lot of people from Stop the War, ordinary campaigners, are being targeted in their homes, on demonstrations, and just generally. So it seems to me that it seems to be preposterous that an anti-terror law should go from the point of stopping people blowing places up and civilians to being a tool for arresting ordinary people practicing things which we would have thought were perfect civil liberties.
I think those laws are used mainly to arrest civilians for no reason whatsoever, rather than to trap terrorists. If you look at the numbers, more than 100 people were already charged, much more than 100 people. For example, the police said they arrested 77 people on Saturday, the 18th. They've arrested many more, so the truth is not told. So all in all, since the 7th of October 23, near 200 people were arrested, most of them under the terror legislation. Now, none of them are terrorists, you know. None of them are related to terrorists. None of them support terrorism. The terrorism that we least support is Israel, the Israeli terror. Israel is a terror state. They are terrorizing civilians all over Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and they definitely mean to do so in Iran. So what we have really is a terror state terrorizing the whole of the Middle East, and it's not starting in 23. It started even before 1948. So that's, in a sense, looking after the language to be accurate. 4 of these 100 and something people are very well-known journalists. Yeah, Sarah Wilkinson, Richard Medhurst, and Asa from
Asa Winstanley,
from Electronic Intifada. So we have very, very senior journalists arrested because they are saying the law allows Palestinians to resist occupation, for example. If you say that, you're arrested. In other words, if you are actually reminding people international law, you know, the international law allows people to resist. The international law disallows genocide. So there are the kind of polarities of the debate. You are not allowed to say that this is genocide on mainstream media. On the other hand, you're also not allowed to say that they have a right to resist. So we are not actually allowed free speech because of the Palestine situation, which reminds us that, you know, that's what Nelson Mandela said. He said, as long as Palestine is not free, none of us is free. We're not free in our country. We're not free here. We're not free anywhere in Europe. We're not free in North America. The West is actually breaking the law and doesn't allow us to remind people that that's what they're doing.
People will presume, and just playing devil's advocate, the state will say, we're doing this for the security of our nation and for the security of Israel as well, because Israel is an ally and it is being attacked by, as they say, proscribed terror organizations. So they're saying essentially that you're breaking the law because you're supporting these proscribed terror groups. What's your reaction to it?
They are proscribed. They shouldn't be. You know, we are allowed to say this, and I'm going to say it. They were prescribed in 2021 because of Israeli pressure. In 2021, almost 1,000 people were killed in the Great March of Return in Gaza. They were not armed. They were just marching towards the lines. They couldn't cross them, you know, but they were marching towards the lines to remind people all over the world that they are under occupation, that they are not allowed to live in the country where they came from, and they are now forced refugees in Gaza. Most of the people of Gaza are, you know, coming from other parts of Palestine. So basically, by prescribing this, they probably are doing Israel a favor, or so they think. But did they? They prescribed Hamas. Hamas actually supported the March of Return, but not by killing Israelis. It supported the people of Palestine's right to demonstrate. Well, they managed to kill quite a lot of people. And what is the result? That 2 years later, life in Israel is not safe. And life in Israel, in a sense, was never safe since it took over Palestine, because that's what happened. People resist the takeover and occupation of their country. If I came to occupy your home, you will resist, probably not with a gun, but you would not take it kindly to it that I am taking you out of your home. And this is what the Palestinians are doing. If there was a law, if the law of the UN, international law and humanitarian international law were honored, then Israel wouldn't be there. But Israel was foisted upon Palestine by a lot of countries that did a lot of damage to Jews in Europe. This is the truth. And they didn't want the Jews in their countries, despite the fact that some of them are not Nazi, of course. They did not want to give a home to the people that were left, like my parents, after the Second World War. And they had no country. So a lot of them, most of them, ended up in Israel and ended up as settler colonials. And what are the Palestinians responsible for exactly in the Holocaust? They never partook in any attacks on Jews until Zionism.
Well, your relationship with Zionism and with Israel is probably something I'd like to bring into this, because it would help people to perhaps understand the real on-the-ground human stories which happen as well, perhaps. And of course, you went from Europe, or your parents went, and you were with them, I assume. In 1941, I think, was when your history with Israel began.
1948.
Yeah. So at that time, it would have been mandated Palestine, wouldn't it?
We came 2 weeks after Israel was proclaimed. So in the beginning of the war, my father refused to be drafted. He refused to be drafted because he was a victim of Nazi violence and Polish violence for 6 years. And that didn't make him a supporter of bloodshed. So he refused to fight, he refused to kill, he refused to carry arms. And for all that, he was put in a Jewish jail. Yeah. So after 2 months in jail, they broke him, and he agreed to be drafted, but unarmed. And so he ended up as a medic, saving many people, but taking all the risks without being able to protect himself because he refused. I didn't know the story until I was 20-something, yeah? So when I wanted to refuse to be drafted, I didn't know the story. I wish I did. That would have given me some courage. But I didn't know until I myself ended up in military jail for something similar. So I think there is, in my family, a history of resisting. Two of my uncles were killed when, as partisans, they attacked Nazi police stations in Poland. And my father didn't want to fight and ended up being in Auschwitz, yeah? So we are not a militarist family, let's put it like this. Yeah. And I was never a militarist, but I ended up as an officer in the IDF, which I didn't want to. But that's how I ended up. And I was never a proper Zionist, but I didn't resist Zionism until I left Israel. And then it became quite, it became natural to me because I was able to read the news from, a distance, not being involved in it every day. And I gravitated to the only Israeli anti-Zionist organization that had a branch in London, and I never looked back. So, I have a history of almost 60 years of opposing Zionism. And when I became an anti-Zionist, you could put us all in a cab. And now there are tens of thousands of us all over Britain and the rest of Europe. There are probably hundreds of thousands of Jewish anti-Zionists. This is an amazing change.
You gave me a statistic, I think, in one of our run-up conversations to the show, and you talked about 40% of young Jews in America now rejecting Zionism, and perhaps 15% here in Britain. That is an amazing figure. Is that a trend as a result of campaigning in the Jewish community, or has it been because of the actions of Israel over the last couple of decades?
Both. I mean, obviously, after the 7th of October, the growth in opposition to Israel is part of every population, not just the Jews of Britain or the Jews of, Britain and US and the whole of Europe, anywhere in the West. People are opposing Israeli genocide. They are right to do so. So in a sense, it's not very surprising that the Jews are part of it. Now, in Britain, the percentage is probably 70%, similarly in the United States. So 40% is lower than the average, but it's very high for the Jewish community. So we have to see it in context. So everywhere, not just in the West, people are opposing the worst genocide of our lifetime.
So let me bring the connection back to terrorism, counter-terrorism laws. The H group is prescribed, the H groups are prescribed, so therefore you can be prosecuted under the Terror Act if you support them openly. That seems to be clear. Yet what we've got a situation, you know the IDF and how it operates. They recruit people from all around the world. So British citizens, essentially, we know, are going to serve in the IDF, serve the Israeli forces. They hold British citizenship. I don't know whether they hold Israeli citizenship, dual citizenship as well. But nonetheless, there was one of the prisoners of war in the recent exchanges that have been taking place was British. The young lady who was a British citizen.
Many Americans as well.
Many Americans. Now, those folk, in your argument, they're basically serving as terrorists.
Why ask me for my view? I'm looking at the UN and at the International Law Convention on Genocide. The Convention of Genocide, which is enforced everywhere in the world. It has universal jurisdiction. Basically, defines anyone who isn't fighting against genocide and doing their best to avoid it or to deny others the right for genocide as a genocider. You know, you either with us or against us on this. This is like fighting Nazism, you know. So genocide is the worst crime in the book. It is the crime of crimes. And the fact that all those countries are actually assisting Israel in committing genocide is raising a lot of the population into action, because they don't think that this is right. They want to support international law against genocide. They don't need more than looking at the newscast coming from Gaza to understand that this is it. Even if the ICJ will take another 50 years or 5 years before they come and say, yes, 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 it's genocide. They said it's plausible genocide. That's enough for most people. And they understand that this is not just a genocide, but one of the worst ever. You know, the use of 1,000 kilo bombs, which actually can kill few thousand people if they fall on an area big enough. This is something that has not happened in my lifetime. So I think the fact that Hamas, who killed about, I think, best, you know, very difficult to say how many of the 1,200 Israelis that were killed on that day were killed by Hamas, for the simple reason that around half were killed by the IDF. On their own evidence, helicopters were shooting missiles that work at burning cars at about 2,000 degrees Celsius. You know, Hamas have nothing that can do that. So all those people that we saw burned to crisps in cars, and many others, were killed by the IDF. In the kibbutzim, many of the people were killed by the IDF because there was a directive to do that. It's called the Hannibal Directive in the IDF. So to stop people being taken alive by Hamas, they would rather kill them. This is the directive. So I would say maybe Hamas and the IDF each killed around half. So this is 600 people killed by Hamas. I'm not supporting this. But I understand it as I understand what happened in Algeria, in other places like Vietnam and so on. People fight for their liberation. And when they fight, they end up killing civilians and soldiers. Half of the people killed on that day were soldiers.
Well, I'm increasingly hearing this clash, this collision between British law or sovereign law of particular nations and the international law. You've made a very clear case of it in terms of genocide and in terms of the way, for instance, the Palestinians would have the right as people who've been essentially occupied or have been, pushed out of their homes and genocided, they would have the right to resist. That's enshrined in international law.
Sure.
At the same time, Britain doesn't want to recognize that. This seems to be your argument. They completely ignore those rights of Palestinians and therefore then proscribe these people if they do resist. I mean, if they do armed resistance, that's regarded as unacceptable. So where do we really go from here in terms of how it's played out here? Because now all of these protesters and demonstrators and activists, yourself included, are being targeted. It seems clear that they're actively being targeted by the police in collusion with the British government themselves, from what I can see from the latest situation in the protests, where the police decided to let certain demonstrators out into Trafalgar Square, and then they kettled them, and then they've now essentially started charging people, and they pull. Now, in that scenario, it seems as though there will be litigation, I gather. What are the protesters, what are the ordinary citizens going to do to push back against this kind of this, if you like, this state sponsored repression and this kind of this surveillance totalitarianism creep, if you like.
Well, they would put a lot of us in jail. There's no doubt about it. I was already arrested, and have no problem telling you that I wasn't. I was arrested under the terror law, but the actual deed that I was arrested for was saying something that you can read in the paper, that Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis are unlikely to be defeated by the IDF. Now, that was considered to be supporting proscribed organizations. Wow. But I'm just reporting a fact, Gods. I mean, I'm saying what in Israel is written every day in Hebrew by people who have enough courage, and what is written even in The Guardian and the New York Times, not on the BBC. And it's clear that the IDF cannot, did not, will not be able to defeat those organizations. I mean, they said they finished Hamas altogether. I mean, look at it. Did they? They didn't finish Hezbollah. They did not defeat the arc of resistance. So why? First of all, Israel has not defeated anyone since 1967. And they cannot fight against people poorly trained and poorly armed as long as those people are fighting for their country. They're fighting for an idea which is really, first and foremost, defending their people against a very brutal occupation. The Israelis are fighting for real estate. They're fighting for territory. So I said something which should be quite obvious to most people that have watched the news for a year, and I was arrested for saying this. Of course, they couldn't prove that this is terror in any, so they let me go after being there some 24 hours or so. They could have kept me there for weeks because the terror law allows this kind of injustice. The lawyers found flaws in their argument that were so glaring that they had to let me go. They will try to arrest me again, but you don't need to actually say, I support Hezbollah. You don't need to say that. You must, if you say, which I did, it cannot be defeated by the Israeli army. It was never defeated in 2006. It was never, the Lebanese forces were not defeated in 1982 when Israel attacked them with 200,000 people and with thousands of tanks. You can't really win against people with tanks. You can win it against an army.
Why do you think Britain is so invested in, first of all, supporting Israel the way it does, but then also now borrowing from their playbook? Because a lot of the methodologies that are being used to implement terror laws and how they're tackling protesters, the violence, the physicality of it. Why is the estate so invested in this?
Let's look at Ireland, that was occupied for 370 years by the British, and still is in a sense, despite the Good Friday Agreement. After hundreds of years of occupying a place, and now it's more than a century in Palestine, the British could not think otherwise. There was no way in which you could persuade the British by talking sense and logic and offering arguments which are legal for them to leave Ireland altogether. You couldn't do it. You can't do it in Palestine either. So of all the people in the world, Britain is the first mainstay of Zionism since 1917. That's 107 years, 108 years now, that Britain is supporting Israel. That's much more difficult to change than, the US in Vietnam, that, they were not even there for 20 years, or even 10. So, when it's a short time, it's possible to actually go back on your word that you'll never leave there and so on, and retreat. Britain wasn't about to retreat after 370 years, and they're not about to retreat now, but that's just a historical reason. In terms of power play, Britain behaves as if it's the empire, but it's not the empire. It is a much depleted version of that empire, and that empire was really terrible anyway. Wherever there is currently a bloody conflict on the planet, look for Britain. India, Pakistan, they were there. Before that, South Africa, they were there. Cyprus, you can just go around the globe, and of course Palestine, and of course Iraq, etc. So the British Empire has left a bloody footprint in every single continent of the planet, and we are now still seeing those on the brink of resolution. You can say that India was resolved, but no, it isn't, because the India-Pakistan goes back to that period. So actually, hardly any of the conflict that Britain has created and supported have ever been resolved. Just look at it. It's amazing. So that is something quite uncanny, that the British Empire is gone, but the damage caused by the British Empire is so much defended by this country, which is still a royal country, which is still behaving imperially, if you want, because it is the attack dog of the empire now. That's all it is, like Israel. So the attack dogs of the empire are fighting like a pack. Interestingly, the British forces leave Akrotiri in Cyprus in order to go to Gaza every day, tens of flights. Yes. Yeah. So one part of the empire, the ex-empire, helps to subdue another part of the ex-empire. And the other thing, of course, Gaza is where Britain came into Palestine in 1917, few days before the Balfour Declaration. Gaza is the gate of Palestine. All forces coming from the north have to pass through Gaza, through the coast road, and that goes 5,000 years in history.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. The British government, again, you get the only argument I hear back is that it's one of security, it's one of economic interests, it's that Israel is a democracy, the only democracy in the region, and that it's an ally and they must support it. But coming to make some connections around why perhaps Keir Starmer or any British Prime Minister would not want to allow your narratives to be spread too much. Well, doesn't the idea of the ICJ genocide push for Israel then implicate the aiders and abettors? And you just mentioned the Cyprus RAF sorties, of which there have been thousands, which are now clearly evidenced by Matt Kennard and others as well. Doesn't that then make our Prime Minister, or most of these Western Prime Ministers, also complicit in genocide?
I think you should get a hotel in The Hague, because if there was application of international law, that's where he would be, together with Genocide Joe and Macron and all the other heroes of the genocide. You didn't mention, but you know of the fact that Britain is one of the main arms suppliers to Israel. It's also buying a lot of arms from Israel. So both of those commercial activities are not commercial, they are illegal. So everything that Britain does, for example, deny genocide, that is making it guilty of genocide.
So counter-terrorism laws, by your argument, is helping to defend Israeli interests, basically by going after the likes of the H groups, which are regarded as their kind of their sworn enemies, their mortal enemies. Yet they're not. The establishment isn't willing to allow a procedure on genocide in a genuine way to take form as any kind of legal law within this country. There's no move for that.
Britain has no place in denying genocide. There is no legal machinery of denying genocide. So what Keir Starmer is saying is total nonsense. It's also illegal. So that's one of the reasons, the least important reason why he should be in the ICC. I'm not holding my breath, you know. But Britain is not actually fighting in the interest of Israel. It's fighting in the interest of a criminal leadership of Israel. Zionism was supposed to protect Jews from violence and atrocity. The only place on earth today where Jews die because of their identity is in Israel. Yeah? So they're not dying in Europe, they're not dying in the United States or Australia. So basically, after all the talk about anti-Semitism that surrounds us, supposedly, and I've written a number of important works on anti-Semitism, I have never met an anti-Semite in the Labour Party. I was a member for many years. I've never met an anti-Semite. And why would you? Because these people are socialists. So that's the last place to look for anti-Semitism. I've never met anti-Semites in the Muslim organizations that I'm working with. I've never met an anti-Semite anywhere. I've been in Britain since 1972. You would have thought that they couldn't hide so well that in 50-something years, I've never met one. I'm not saying there aren't anti-Semites, but they're not where the government is looking for them. They are on the extreme right, which supports Israel with Israeli flags and with the Union Jack.
One of the blowbacks that I'm sensing is that the more you try to hide a truth, the more you try to protect something which is absolutely wrong, the more you highlight it. And it seems to me that what you're talking about is just going to highlight the Jews in the West, who previously actually nobody was really that bothered about. It does seem, though, after this period of genocidal activity, as you've outlined, now the world is focusing and equating Israel often with Jews and often with Judaism as well, perhaps.
This is because Israel has actually made this inevitable. They say that they are a Jewish state, and they're speaking for all the Jews. Those two are lies. First of all, Israel is not Jewish. Why? Because for 2,000 years, Jews have experienced a lot of violence in Europe, but they never were the violent party. They did not commit genocide. They did not assist genocide. They were genocided against. So in 2,000 years of European Jewry, not only is there no genocide, but there are exceptional examples for life together of the communities. For example, in Spain, under the Muslims, what we call the convivencia. The convivencia, meaning, you know, living together, coexistence, was 800 years, during which Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived together in harmony, and that was the only place in Europe that this happened, because it was not controlled by the Christian church. Wherever the Christian church, and it doesn't matter if it was the Catholic or the Protestant, or, you know, Jews have suffered immensely from no rights to purchase land, to do all kind of jobs, to move from one place to another, to till the land, you know, to the Holocaust. This is a continuum, yeah? Denial of rights to the denial of life. So there is a history in Europe, which is not shared, say, by the Arab world, by the Muslim world. In the Muslim world, there was convivencia. In Palestine itself, the only time the Jews were killed was during the Crusades, where they were killed not just with the Muslims, but with the Christians of Jerusalem. The Christians, having lived peacefully with the other two co-religionists, were basically all finished off because they were not halal. They were living with Jews and with Muslims in peace, therefore they couldn't live no more, and the Crusaders killed them. So this is the one disturbing episode, or period, for 100 years, that, Jews, Christians and Muslims died together because of racism coming from Europe.
So what would your advice be to the Western Jewish diaspora in particular, given that your narrative seems to say that actually the terror laws which supposedly protect Zionism, Jews, Israelis from the terror of the H groups is actually in a way a self-defeating.
Well, it's obviously self-defeating. The Jews of Israel are not safe, will not be safe ever, as long as they are what they are, brutal genociders and occupiers, an apartheid nation. They will not be safe, no more than the whites were safe in South Africa when they operated an apartheid republic. So basically, our advice is very simple. First of all, any Jew who supports Israel is a genocider himself. Not to talk about the 2,500 to 3,000 that actually went there to kill people in Gaza. And some of them are still there, as you know. So these people should be in the ICC. Every single one of them should be in the ICC. They should not be allowed as British citizens to go to fight in Israel's war. And the fact that they are allowed is in itself illegal. I'm not even talking about immoral. So that's the first thing. You cannot support, as a Jew, you cannot support a genocide because this was done to you. This was done to my family. Can I support a genocide? Can you support a genocide? Any normal person is required to struggle against genocide, never to hide it, never to partake in it.
Just something occurred to me that we had Piers Morgan, a well-known journalist here in Britain, and somebody who talks about Palestine, Zionism, and Judaism very often on his programs. Piers Morgan, in an interview with Tucker, another famous journalist from America, they were in conversation, I think, just a few days ago, and their conversation veered towards the question of whether it was okay to kill children and women in a war situation and scenario. And Tucker Carlson, I think that's what his name is, Tucker Carlson found it incredible that Piers seemed to think it was okay that you could kill children and women. You could target women and children in a war. It does seem as though that the morality of some people within mainstream media and maybe governments also needs addressing. It seems as though they want to justify that kind of killing.
Well, first of all, let us address our Prime Minister, who is the only leader in the world who is a human rights lawyer in the past. Now, this human rights lawyer is making sure that the people of Britain don't have their human rights. The right to free speech, the right for international law, the right for upkeep of international law by exposing and bringing to justice people who commit crimes like the crime of crimes, genocide. So this is a person who is actually supporting and protecting those Jews that went there to kill. None of them is going to be brought to justice. This is against the law. This is also against the law in Britain, because Britain is a signatory to the Genocide Convention. It accepted it into its law book. For example, if Netanyahu comes to Britain, the ICC has, a price on their heads, so to speak. They need to be arrested everywhere. I have no doubt that if they came to Britain, they will not be arrested. This week, a general who is very central in the Israeli genocide has come as a very honored visitor of the armed forces of Britain. This is totally illegal. This is totally immoral. This is totally illogical that we should support genocide, and yet it still continues. So yes, the second piece of advice to Jews are, if they wish, like I do, and like most Palestinians do, that Jews should live in peace in Palestine, there's only one way they could do so: to end Zionism, to end apartheid, to end genocide, to end ethnic cleansing, to end all the many, many war crimes that Israel is responsible for, and have one state in the whole of Palestine, like before that UN resolution, which caused the Nakba, immediately caused the Nakba. Once they decided to divide Palestine, unjustifiably and unnecessarily, they caused the war. I mean, the test of this is in the eating. The minute that they passed that resolution, the war started. So there is no reason why Jews who want to live in peace and equality should not live in Palestine. The Palestinians are amazingly generous. I don't know that many other groups that suffered so much will do so, but the Palestinians are saying, live with us in peace, live with us in equality, live with us as equals in Palestine, and you'll be fine. And you'll be protected like everybody else. Without that, racist Jews, ultra-nationalist Jews, genocidal Jews that want to live there, they don't belong there.
Well, your warnings seem to indicate that this terrorism could well turn into something very different. Like if people started to equate or make the connection between Zionism, Jews, and terror, that could have real, genuine impact on the notion of anti-Semitism.
Exactly.
So this is a very big danger. But let me, in our concluding 10 minutes or so, I want to put the context of counter-terrorism as a law beyond that connection that we've clearly made between the way the government is using counter-terrorism as a way of subjugating its own citizens or stopping their freedom of speech in the case of pro-Palestinian activists. But it doesn't stop there, does it, Professor? Because what I've noticed is people who might be, for instance, protesting about climate change or protesting about, I don't know, other civil rights and liberties, they too, perhaps if the law can be bent in this way to target pro-Palestinian activists, is it also being used against other activists?
Definitely. I mean, some people are now getting 5 and 6 years in jail for climate action. I mean, they should be honored. They are fighting against the destruction of the earth. They are very honorable people. They are trying to protect the people who have not even been born. Instead, they are putting into jail. And now they're talking about more than 10 years for some of them. I think this is terrible. And I was there yesterday, the day before, when Tony Greenstein was arraigned at the High Court. And he was told by his lawyers that he's spending, he may have to spend some years in jail for saying that the Palestinians have a right to fight for freedom according to UN, legislation.
He's another Jewish anti-Zionist.
Yeah, and he's quite famous. Yeah, so I was put into jail for the same reason. So the idea that by telling people that international law allows something, you are likely to to end up in jail for years is totally mad. What is illegal about international law in Britain?
I haven't raised Muslims, but we know that there's Prevent and there are all sorts of other laws which have been used since 9/11 to target also Muslim communities. So it seems that whether you're an environmental activist or a pro-Palestinian activist, or if you're a religious activist even perhaps, you could all be targeted. So this isn't something that's just now focusing on people who want to blow up buildings and kill civilians, etc., for a religious cause that isn't even based in this country. It seems as though that law can actually violate all sorts of civil liberties.
The law was accepted by people because they thought it is a way to act against people who kill people in the streets with bombs and so on.
They still do, perhaps.
This is a lie. Basically, the main use of the law was to silence people in campaigns. My work now concentrates on Islamophobia in the West. And Britain is one of the important centers. Remember the riots in the summer, just after the election, that were fueled clearly by Islamophobia, and lies, of course, online lies, but mainly by Islamophobia. Reform is an Islamophobic movement. There are Islamophobes in leading positions in the other parties. This is not a joke. To end, I want to say that Islamophobia has traditionally, in the 10th century, come from Christian circles. In the 20th century, it came from mainly Zionists. The main theoreticians and historians that wrote Islamophobic texts were very important Zionist professors. One of them was a Brit, and others were Americans. There was a very good group of French professors, all Islamophobes. The kind of draconian legislations in France, like I was speaking in Paris on Wednesday night before thousands of people, and they told us, please, when you go out, put your kafirs into your backpack, because you will be arrested, because anyone with a kafir, especially if they're not totally white.
The Palestinian scarf.
Yeah. So, there is a very strong tradition of Islamophobia now taking over the West. All the right-wing governments in, of course, France, which is, a case in question, but also Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Austria, Hungary, Holland. I mean, all those right-wing parties are against Muslims. They are Islamophobes. They say that they are against migrants, but the main migration is by Muslims, and they're against that.
It seems to me there's a battleground then. If the battleground is between those who want to maintain freedom, liberty, civil rights, and those who want more repressive powers, more laws, then I suppose one of the areas that is going to be fought over is the legislation itself. Is there a possibility for legal action to try and change the terror laws?
We're just working on that. The climate activists, as you know, took action in the High Court against the overzealous punishments, and we are going to do the same about unlawful arrest and any punitive measures which is used against our members. We're talking about 200 people who are already arrested. Some of them spent, before being charged, 6 weeks in solitary confinement with such limitations that you only want to put on mass murderers. People that have not harmed a fly were sitting 6 weeks in jail without any rights whatsoever, without legal rights of representation, etc. So this country is acting against its own laws. This is not in the interest of the British people, it's against them. So I think we must go to the legal profession and ask them to look at their own practice that the government is forcing them into. I'm sure a lot of them are very unhappy about it.
Well, Professor Haim Bresheeth, thank you so much for giving us your time and raising these absolutely vital issues, things which actually affect us on a day-to-day basis. Often laws and legal requirements become blandly accepted, but there are some, it seems, that we must stand against, we must inquire, we must look more deeply. What is this terrorism act, and how does it affect ordinary people's lives, and how should we really be getting involved in trying to get the balance right? Nobody wants real terror acts to take place, but even with those real terror acts, if security is cited every time anybody asks any questions, any journalists ask questions about who are the terrorists, who's behind the terrorists, who is funding terrorism, and if those murky money trails and the murky links around that are only in control of government hands or the deep state, the intelligence services, the security services, then where are we? We're left blind. We have to make decisions based on the trust we have in politicians, and it seems increasingly that the politicians seem to be voting in directions which are prescribed to them and by corporations, by foreign governments. Israel has been the big discussion here. It does seem as though there's a lot of influence that these forces, which are not democratic, have on the way we form laws and our legislation. It seems certainly the Terror Act is something that we all need to look very carefully at. In fact, the Terror Acts across the West in particular should not become a tool for securitization, for further repression of the freedom of speech, and they shouldn't become a tool for scaring journalists and basically muffling their voices. They should really be, I think, re-scrutinized, it seems, and it seems that whether we like it or not, that battleground and the debate around that is only going to get hotter with the increased severity of actions by police and by the state operators around these sort of issues. Today we've highlighted the pro-Palestinian movement, but of course this is a much broader discussion, a much broader range of people and campaigners and activists who have been being impacted. Thank you for watching this edition of the Deep Dive Perspective. Do hit that like, share and subscribe button if you want us to be able to make more programs like this and to improve them with even better guests, even better narratives. Thank you so much for watching this edition.